Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss how to recession-proof state higher education. My name is Shia Cabas, and I'm the Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. First and foremost, I want to thank the Kresge Foundation for enabling us to be here today and for supporting all the work that went into this project. I also want to acknowledge Kevin Miller, who was our Associate Director for Higher Education, who has since transitioned out of BPC, but he was the lead on this project and want to commend him for all the great work that he did. We're here today to present a new tool that BPC is rolling out, as well as have a broader discussion with a terrific panel of experts about the question of affordability in higher education and consistency of funding. Historically, states have shouldered much of the higher education funding burden through state appropriations, with federal dollars supporting students more directly through loans and grants. Over the past several decades, though, state investments in higher education have declined as a share of their tax base, particularly during economic downturns, shifting costs more heavily onto students and therefore the federal government. Now, it's certainly not the only reason, but as state funding for higher education has dropped off, prices have risen dramatically, and more students have been relying on federal grants and loans to pursue a college degree. Each year, the federal government distributes nearly $150 billion in federal student aid. And this number fails to include unpredictable and costly federal rescues like those that we saw during the pandemic. In 2020, BPC's Task Force on Higher Education Financing and Student Outcomes issued recommendations to rethink the federal and state roles in higher education, with the goal of better promoting affordability and accountability throughout the system. A cornerstone of their package was flexible block grants to the states, which would go towards affordability initiatives and rainy day funds. Right around the time of our report release, Senators Susan Collins and Jack Reed introduced the PASS Act, which proposes to set up something like this type of Fed state program. And since then, in the wake of the COVID-19 economic downturn and the federal government's massive emergency infusion of resources into the higher education system, there have been increasing conversations about rainy day funds that could avert such situations in the future and protect taxpayer dollars. That's why today's conversation is so timely. We know higher ed financing needs a paradigm shift, and the tool we're presenting today can help policymakers explore what that new design should look like. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Natalie Butler, who is our research analyst on BPC's higher education team. And Natalie has been doing fantastic work in leading on this tool and on the underlying policy. So I'm going to turn it over to her to give a little more context and walk through the tool that users can experiment with to learn more about what this proposal could look like. Natalie?
Thank you, Shai. So out of this task force came the idea of a new federal program with an annual matching grant for states to promote college affordability for low and middle income students, as well as improve important metrics like completion and return on investment. Participation in this program would be optional, but the goal is to make this appealing to most states. And that's why it's important to ensure they would be given much flexibility in how they deploy these funds, so long as it's used to reduce unmet student need, improve student outcomes, or some combination of the two. Now, to be eligible for these matching federal grants, states would be required to increase higher education spending above a rolling 3-year average. For every additional state dollar invested above this average, the federal government would provide a match. A portion of either the state's annual allocation and or the federal match would then be set aside into a rainy day fund. This fund would be held by the federal government and used only to support consistent higher education funding during recessions. One major goal of this initiative is to prepare states to better weather economic recessions without having to make deep cuts to higher education budgets and worsen affordability issues. By tying federal block grants to a state match and maintenance of effort requirement, the federal government can incentivize states to invest in higher education while safeguarding taxpayer dollars, thereby improving access and completion, especially for low and middle income students. BPC estimates that a decade of federal investment via such block grants with a partial state match could generate $170 billion in additional personal income due to increased educational attainment, which in turn would generate over $20 billion in new federal revenue and a similar amount of new state revenue, which would partially offset the program's upfront cost. So over the last year, we've been working closely with NCHEMS to model BPC's flexible block grant proposal and create an interactive tool that allows for some model parameters to be adjusted dynamically for all 50 states. This lets users generate state-specific data on the grant size and amount of time to fill these rainy day funds. The tool is important because it is a first attempt at capturing what this kind of federal-state partnership would look like and how its design features could help recession-proof higher education. Some of the common questions we've gotten as we've been working on putting together this rainy day fund is, how big do rainy day funds need to be? How quickly can the funds be filled? How large of a federal investment is needed? Should rainy day funds be filled using federal dollars, state dollars, or both? The tool can be helpful in answering these questions. So let's go ahead and take a look at the rainy day calculator itself. So as you can see here in the actual tool, there's various dynamic variables that can be adjusted. As I walk through this, I will be adjusting the variables as an example, but this is really just a jumping off point. First, we have the new federal block grant funding for rainy day funds and affordability. This is the combined total amount of funding provided by the federal government for states each year. The user can specify the size of the annual federal investment ranging from $1 billion to $10 billion. This is the amount that would be allocated if all states participated fully in the program. Based on some modeling that we've done at BPC and analysis, we anticipate a program like this needing about $6 billion annually to make a meaningful impact. So I'll go ahead and adjust that to $6 billion. Next, you have the federal dollars received per dollar of new state spending. This is the amount of federal funding on the table for each new dollar of state investment. Federal government matching ranges from 50 cents on the dollar to $8 on the dollar. And it's important to note that in order to participate in the program, a state's spending must exceed current spending. They cannot redirect or reduce the amount of state funding provided as these federal funds come in. In terms of state investment, BPC has found a match of 25% or $1 of state money per $4 of federal investment to be a good starting point. Moving down, we want to consider the goal size of these rainy day funds, particularly the state rainy day funds. In other words, what target are we trying to reach in order to fill the funding gap caused by an economic downturn? The tool allows users to adjust the target size of these funds based on the most recent annual level of state spending on higher education. Target sizes for these funds range from 10% to 30% of annual state spending on higher ed. Higher targets will take longer to reach, but will provide more cushion in an economic downturn. Let's set the target size of these rainy day funds to 15% of recent annual state spending on higher education. Moving along, you have the estimated annual rate of return on the rainy day funds. This field allows users to specify the estimated rate of return on the investments held by these rainy day funds, ranging from 4% to 8%. Naturally, assuming greater investment returns reduces the amount of time required to fill the rainy day funds. But of course, higher expected returns tend to come with more risk. So for now, let's assume investments receive a 6% rate of return. All right, lastly, we have the two fields at the bottom with the federal contribution to rainy day funds and the state contribution to rainy day funds. So you have the federal over here and the state contributions over here. The user can adjust the percentage of federal funds that are directed to fill the rainy day funds, with the remaining amount being invested in college affordability efforts. The same goes for the state contributions to rainy day funds. The user can adjust the percentage of new state funds that are directed to fill the rainy day funds, and the remainder being funneled to college affordability investments. For now, let's evenly split the federal money between filling these rainy day funds and investing in affordability measures. And then for the states, let's look at what 100% investment in affordability would do. We've seen based on our modeling that this is where you will really see those immediate cost savings for students. On average, we found that it takes about 5 years to fill these funds, given the selections that we've just input. But that's going to vary depending on the state. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example state, and I'll go ahead and pick Missouri. So you can see all 50 states here. You can scroll down to select whatever state you may want and look at the different results for all of the states. So once you've set the parameters of the state you want to see, like I said, I've picked Missouri, but you can select whichever you'd like, and you can always go back and change them again. You can go ahead and pull up your results down here from the tool. And this does adjust dynamically. So if I were to go up here and change this, you'll see the tool will automatically make those adjustments down here. So you can see based on the results here that Missouri currently spends about $1.1 billion annually on higher education. Given the parameters set above, the target rainy day fund amount is a little under $160 million each year. So it's going to take a little under, the rainy day fund target amount is $160 million, and it's going to take a little under 2 years to fill that. In these boxes, we broke down, in these two boxes, we broke down where state and federal dollars are going between the rainy day fund and affordability efforts. So you can see here that of federal dollars received, Missouri would receive close to $107 million of federal money. And if we did that 50-50 split, with half of it going to filling those rainy day funds and half of it to contributing to college affordability efforts, you can see an even 50-50 split, with about $53 million going to fill these rainy day funds and $53 million going to college affordability efforts. Now on the state side, you can see that Missouri would be contributing close to $27 million. Of that, given the parameters that we've set above, they would be contributing $0 to the rainy day funds, and all of that $26.7 million would be directed to college affordability funding. This tool is just one step in the policy development process. However, the information we have gained from this model is essential to tackling higher education affordability. If we waved a magic wand and enacted all of these policy changes, we could recession-proof state higher education funds within 5 years. Knowing the amount of money required and the time it will take to fill these rainy day funds gives policymakers an idea of where to start. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it back to Shai. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. That was great. I am privileged to be joined now by Sophia Laderman, who's the Associate Vice President at the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, or SHEO, and Michele Shepard, Senior Director of College Affordability at the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS. Higher education loves these long acronyms. Welcome to both of you. And I'm not going to read through their extensive bios here, but you can view them online, and suffice it to say, they're both incredibly experienced and well-versed in the issues that we're here to talk about today. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. Michele, let me start with you. And why don't we begin by talking about the big picture and taking a step back for a moment from the tool. So TICAS has produced research on how higher education financing affects institutions and students, and making sure that those public funds are targeted towards those institutions and students that can benefit most has been a real priority for your organization. Can you help us understand how the current financing structure from the federal and state governments contributes to the affordability challenges that we have with higher education today?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So currently, both the federal government and state governments make large investments in public higher education. So state governments, for their part, operate public colleges and universities. Collectively, public colleges enroll more than 3/4 of all undergraduates, which is often a figure people are surprised to hear because we hear so much in the news about kind of the marquee, Ivy League schools and the big flagship institutions, but more than 75% of students are served by public colleges, so that's important to keep in mind. And the federal government, for its part, provides financial aid directly to students through basically voucher-like student aid programs, including need-based aid, the big one there being the Pell Grant program, along with the federal student loan program, in addition to providing direct support to public institutions, for example, via research funding. So meanwhile, state support has been declining for public higher education for decades, and I know Sophia will speak more in detail to that when she talks us through her reports. But the cost of college as a result has shifted ever more from a public responsibility to an individual one. So we see the cost of attending what were once affordable and meant to be affordable public institutions. We see those costs continuing to rise. And this includes costs beyond just tuition and fees. And most families are not able to cover these costs out of pocket. So most students now take on debt to pay for college. And alongside this, many public colleges lack the resources to adequately support their students. And open access public colleges especially, so community colleges, as well as public HBCUs and many other minority serving institutions, they face particular funding challenges. They have been chronically underfunded compared to other public institutions, and so these trends are compounded for those institutions. So while state systems rely very heavily on federal aid, again, on those kind of voucher-like programs, especially the Pell Grant program and the federal loan program, they share no official direct statutory relationship. So this impedes coordination, it impedes the federal government's ability to kind of incentivize affordability, and it leaves states very vulnerable to the effects of economic downturns, since states don't have the same deficit spending powers that the federal government does. So there is a ton of evidence that funding for public colleges and state financial aid basically takes the form of what we call a balance wheel in state budgets. So unlike the federal government, almost all states are required to balance their budgets. Vermont is the one exception, although Vermont does typically behave as though they have a balanced budget requirement. So because state funding for higher ed is discretionary, cuts often occur when states are facing significant pressure, often via legal mandates to fund other state programs, including K-12 education, including Medicare and Medicaid, on suddenly limited or reduced revenues during downturns. So to make up for these shortfalls, we see states typically shift costs onto students via increased tuition and fees because they have the ability to do so. There are not a lot of other areas in state budgets where they have kind of that release valve where you can just charge residents to backfill the funding there. And then many institutions also seek, understandably, more reliable funding streams to supplement the declining state spending. So we see many more selective public institutions are increasingly recruiting students, including higher income state residents, as well as many out-of-state students and international students who can afford to pay more tuition to, again, a more reliable stream. Leaves many lower and middle income students behind. States are also reticent because of this volatility to make longer term investments, given this fear of having to continue the funding during future downturns, as well as budget limitations and projected enrollment declines. So beyond the financial burden that this puts on students and their families, declines in state funding have also diminished students' ability to complete a degree. So we see, as a result of these funding cuts, decreased instructional spending, which generally means fewer course offerings, less flexible course offerings, larger class sizes, cuts in student services. So basically a reduction across the board in all of the things that we know are helpful and successful in getting students across the finish line to the graduation stage. So I will talk a little bit momentarily about the COVID piece here, because pre-COVID, TICAS and a lot of other folks in the field talked a lot about planning for the next recession. And we used kind of as a basis for our mechanisms to address these concerns what we'd seen during past recessions. So typically, the Great Recession was a prime example where state higher education funding was hit very hard. We basically used that and projected out and called on policymakers to put mechanisms in place to counteract these trends based on what we've seen in the past. So typically during economic downturns, There are actually rising college enrollments, so higher education is counter-cyclical in that way. So less funding, more enrollment, that's kind of the trend that we were trying to account for and how we were thinking about this recession-proofing mechanism. The COVID recession, as everyone knows, did not follow the typical counter-cyclical trend. Enrollment actually declined significantly. The federal government also, as in the Great Recession, did step in to provide emergency aid, but this time the federal aid came very quickly and it came with significant funding specifically set aside for higher education. And while this aid had the intended effect, I think, of alleviating the emergency financial concerns of most institutions, it was temporary. And there is a funding cliff that institutions and students are facing coming soon. So while the COVID recession was unique in many ways, it did further illustrate the precariousness of state funding for public higher ed. And it's a little bit early, I think, to really know the extent of the COVID recession's long-term impact on state finances, because a lot of state budgets are doing really well right now, so it's a little bit hard to project out. It will probably, all of that funding eventually will dry up, and we will likely see kind of what we saw in the past in terms of that more counter-cyclical trend. And without federal intervention and creating this coordination between federal and state investments, we will probably continue to see the trend of shifting ever more of the burden onto students.
Thanks, Michele. You gave us a lot to unpack there, which is great. So I want to get Sophia in here. And as I mentioned at the top, Sophia leads SHIO's survey, is a leader at SHIO, and she leads SHIO's survey of higher education finance, which churns out data sets that are used by many researchers and organizations. And in fact, PPC used it for our modeling in this project. And so, Sophia, this gives you personally a lot of insight into how spending on higher education has fluctuated over time. Can you elaborate a little bit on what Michele was saying in terms of what we know about how recessions impact state higher education spending, both in general national trends and maybe to the extent you can, elaborating with some specific state examples as well? And then Michele was also talking about the specific impact of COVID and how the federal government has stepped in. And so perhaps looking at how that response and the effect is different from prior iterations of those economic downturns.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Michele gave a really good overview of what's been happening over the last several decades, but I'll give a little bit of additional detail and go into some state examples. So as Michele said, higher education is seen as a discretionary item in state budgets because it has another revenue source through student tuition. And states have other areas that they need to fund, especially when tax revenues are going down during economic recessions or downturns. So higher education has historically been cut more than any other budget area during recessions. And these cuts have been getting steeper with each recession. So if you go back to the 1980s, which is kind of as early as we have great data on this, typically we would see when there was an economic recession, a couple of years of slight to moderate cuts to higher education. And as Michele mentioned as well, enrollment is typically going up at the same time as students are going back to college because the unemployment rate is rising. So in the 1980s and 1990s, we saw recessions that led to some cuts in higher education funding, either because states actually cut funding or because enrollment increased so much and states couldn't keep up with that. So per student spending declined. But following those recessions, we would see a complete and even more than a complete recovery where once states had stronger budgets, they would dedicate those additional revenues back to higher education and per student funding would even out. Starting in the early 2000s with the tech bust, that trend changed slightly. Following the tech bust, there were only about 3 years of economic recovery for states. And so they didn't have enough time essentially to restore funding to prior levels. We then had the Great Recession where we saw the biggest enrollment spike coupled with the biggest decline in state budgets at the same time. So this meant that higher education funding per student declined to the lowest levels ever from states. And that starting point in 2008 before this recession was already at a low point because things had not recovered from the early 2000s recession. So there was kind of a double whammy here that really affected higher education funding. And we're still trying to recover from that, even though it was at this point over a decade ago. So we have had at the national level more than 10 years of recovery and increases in state funding for higher education. There's a lot of variation by states though. So where we're at a point now is that some states have fully recovered, and their current per student funding levels are similar to, maybe slightly below or slightly above, but very close to what they used to be. In the majority of states, that's not necessarily the case. 37 states have lower funding than they did in 2000, 2001 on a per student basis. And there are some states where funding declined during those last two recessions and has pretty much not recovered at all. So there are some states that funding per student has declined more than 40% or around 40% since the early 2000s. The states that are kind of in the worst shape there are Oklahoma, Nevada, Louisiana, and Arizona. So each of those states is at about 40% less funding per student today than in the early 2000s. On the other hand, some states are doing pretty well. So California, Hawaii, Washington, and Wyoming all have pretty strong state support per student today compared to prior years. In some of those states, like in Washington, state funding did decline, but it's gone back up quite a bit. In Wyoming, they didn't really see this per student decline in the same extent as other states. So things are quite varied. The other piece of this is that, as Michele mentioned, the COVID recession was very different and kind of bucked all of these past trends. So all of our modeling at SHIO as well was not really able to predict what would happen. So we actually did not see a decline in state funding following the 2020 recession, which is wonderful. And we know that that occurred primarily for two reasons. One is that enrollment declined rather than increasing. So when you're looking at per student funding and you have enrollment declines, even if there are some cuts, things are looking better at the per student level. The other thing is that the federal government stepped in really quickly and provided a lot of funding, both directly to institutions and to states. So that gets into kind of the second part of this question about how the federal government has been involved in trying to help with state funding during recessions. So the first real involvement was during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, when state budgets were really decimated, and the Obama administration stepped in and passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, or ARRA. This provided funding directly to states through the Education Stabilization Fund and the Government Services Fund, which states could choose to allocate in a couple different ways. And most states chose to allocate at least some of that aid to higher education. So between 2009 and 2011, states allocated just under $10 billion in federal stimulus funds to higher education to try to beef up their funding for higher ed and make up for some of their cuts. What we saw, though, is that when those funds ran out, state funding still was doing really poorly and hadn't really recovered at all. So there was a fiscal cliff, as Michele mentioned, in 2012, after the federal funding ended and before states were really able to increase their investments. So 2012 is on record as the worst year ever for per student state funding, and we've been trying to increase from there. And states have made really strong investments in many cases, not all, but there have been really strong commitments to trying to increase funding for higher education. It's just coming from such a low point. And then during the COVID recession, the response was similar, where there were actually 3 different stimulus and relief packages that passed, each of which provided some aid to states, as well as aid directly to institutions. So since 2020, we're at about $8.8 billion of aid that states have allocated to higher education. But there's a huge pot of money, and this is quite different from the last recession. I believe it's about $77 billion that have gone directly to institutions to help with increased costs due to the pandemic. So there are some similarities there in the government's response, but it has definitely been a stronger and faster response this time around.
Thanks, Sophia. That was a great overview. And it strikes me how many interrelated problems there are here in terms of state disinvestment that leads to higher costs for students, leads to higher costs for taxpayers, and these eroding state budgets over time, which are caused by the recessions and the failure of higher education to be able to compete with the other priorities to work back into those spaces. So, one element that I want to emphasize is what you were talking about, that often when we hit these road bumps on an economic basis and the states aren't able to invest, what we end up with is a federal bailout, effectively, of the higher education system. And I think that's what makes this issue so bipartisan, is that, of course, typically Democrats are more willing to spend funding and Republicans are less willing to do that, certainly at a federal level. But what we often see, absent any type of policy, such as the one we're here to talk about today, is the federal government coming in and throwing tons of money at a problem without a lot of planning, probably being used incredibly inefficiently. And if we had some type of more predictable system that was ensuring stability, we wouldn't need those types of infusions of funds that are probably going to be used much less efficiently than funding that was predictable and just filling the gaps that are needed as the states go through the economic downturn. I also want to, before we get to the conversation about solutions, which we'll turn to in just a second, I wanted to ask you both if you have any thoughts on how these economic downturns disproportionately impact more vulnerable populations. So, low and moderate income students, students of color. What sort of effects do you think this has on their ability to afford and complete a higher education? Either of you to go first, or Michele, if you want to go first, and turn to Sophia.
Sure. So as I think we both mentioned, we saw enrollment declines during the COVID recession, and even after the recession and the economy started to turn, the enrollment declines still continued. And those were concentrated among students from low-income backgrounds, students of color, and students who enrolled at community colleges. And so I think the trends that I mentioned earlier, where institutions are seeking revenue sources in the form of students who can pay higher tuition, recruiting out-of-state students, all of these things mean that the students who are not as equipped to pay out of pocket are kind of last on institutions' list of who they want to enroll and who they want to recruit. And so that's one concern. There's also just the basic concern of families have fewer dollars in their pocket, and their budgets are, as well as the state budget, family budgets are in decline as well during downturns. And so students have fewer resources. They need to work more hours. They are often brought into positions where they have to take on additional responsibilities at home that can impede their ability to enroll in or stay enrolled in school. And again, that's where things like decreased class sizes and fewer course offerings and less flexible class offerings and things like that can really impede enrollment and persistence for students from lower income backgrounds. Because if they have a very busy schedule where they have care of relatives or childcare, or they need to work a job with an unpredictable schedule, it's really important that they have those flexible offerings and options to enroll in classes. And if all of those things are being cut and limited based on lower revenues and lower funding for their institution, then again, they probably are not able to make that all work. And of course, the first thing to go is, they're not going to not go to work or not take care of their family. And so they have to make the difficult decision to either not enroll in school or often leave a program that they were enrolled in. And so it's not only more expensive, less affordable, but it's also just really difficult to fit it into people's lives.
Yeah, thanks, Michele. Sophia, anything you wanted to add there before we jump into solutions?
Yeah, and I agree with everything Michele said. I would add that we know, and Michele mentioned this earlier, but we know that state funding increases student enrollment, it increases retention at public institutions, it increases graduation rates and overall state attainment. Those effects are largest for low-income students, students of color, and first-generation students. So state funding is incredibly important for those students. And in the lack of state funding, we see those students in particular becoming more likely to attend for-profit institutions where they have much worse outcomes, both for student loan debt and graduation rates. And we see declining graduation rates for those student populations in particular. A large part of why this happens is because low-income students and students of color are most likely to attend more regional institutions that don't have the ability to bring in alternative revenues. So for those institutions, they can't bring in more out-of-state students and international students. They can't bring in as many research dollars. So instead of looking to alternative revenues to fix the gap in state funding, they become more and more efficient, which eventually gets to a point where they're cutting student services, they're cutting course offerings, all the things Michele was mentioning. So low-income students and students of color are most likely to be at those institutions that suffer the most from the loss in state funding.
That's a great point to emphasize. So it's both the institutions that they're attending, and then also within the institution, of course, they will have the most difficulty paying for any types of increased costs or persevering despite lack of support services that are being offered by the institution. So let's dive into a little bit of the solution side of this, because that's why we're really gathered here today, is to work towards a more sustainable funding stream for higher education, one that can help with predictability, affordability, and avoid these types of expensive bailouts from the federal government. So when we think about some of the features that are necessary for a successful approach, one of the main elements needs to be a structure that counters this trend of state disinvestment, especially during economic downturns. So wondering whether you both think that this kind of flexible block grant model that BPC has outlined can accomplish this? If not, what else do you think is necessary? And if so, what features are important to incentivize the state investment and to reverse this general trend towards a reliance on tuition and fees, especially for public institutions? So Michele, you want to kick us off?
Sure, happy to. So the first thing I'll say is when we talk about a federal state funding partnership, I think it's really important that we focus on the word partnership, because we need to leverage the resources and the unique, especially the deficit spending powers of the federal government, while really accounting for variations across state systems and striking that right balance between flexibility, also ensuring that we are incentivizing equitable and sustainable investments. If the federal government is going to put all of this money towards state higher ed, then we need to have some kind of strings attached. But I think there is a bit of a disconnect among policymakers, where federal policymakers maybe aren't quite as attuned to the perspective of state policymakers and what they actually are facing in their legislative sessions, what they're actually looking at with balancing their budgets, and are not necessarily tuned in to how to make it work across all of these systems. And so I think that's where a flexible block grant approach becomes very attractive. Again, there's a balance to be struck. We don't want it to be too flexible to the point where it's just federal money being shoveled to states with no kind of strings attached to incentivize what federal policymakers are looking to incentivize. But again, I think there's been a lack from the federal side. And I say this as someone who has worked in federal policy for a while. There is kind of a blind spot toward accounting for the experiences of state legislators and kind of what the unique challenges they face in all these ecosystems are. So that cooperative design approach, I think, is going to be really important. And that will ensure that there is a higher likelihood of state uptake and more enthusiastic long-term buy-in to the system from state policymakers. Because I think that's the other piece federal policies, proposals don't often account for, is we can stand something like this up and have it funded for 3 or 5 or 8 years. But if the amount of federal funding is declining and we're hoping to kind of get states on an on-ramp and then everyone will be pedaling their bike on their own, that's not creating a sense of long-term investment from the state side. And especially given the turnover in state legislators, that's just not really sustainable. And we're going to end up right back in the same place that we are, with kind of the need for a bailout when something goes wrong. And so, again, I would just emphasize that partnership piece. Again, there's different ways to approach it, whether it's a block grant or whether it's something a little bit different than that. But I also think something that's really politically important is some kind of clear affordability guarantee to students, whether it's free, whether it's debt-free, whether it covers 2-year programs, whether it covers 4-year programs. These are all things that will be litigated. But I think in order to get the level of buy-in that would be needed to make this big investment, there does need to be something clear to students that says, here is what you are going to get. That allows the federal side to say, here is why, an administration, for example, is going to put a lot of their capital into supporting something like this, because we are able to communicate from a political standpoint that this is the effect on affordability for students and families. So I think that can be one concern that I might have about an entirely flexible block grant approach that doesn't account for any kind of affordability guarantee. I think it creates some political concerns where it's difficult to communicate to families, and it's difficult to garner political buy-in as to why a program like that is important.
That's really interesting. And I wonder if there's some sort of balance there where you could create some flexibility within that guarantee for how states are approaching it, whether 2 years, 4 years, it's with a bunch of different options, but effectively being able to communicate some dramatic reduction in price and an easy message of affordability to students and their families so that you get that political buy-in. Sophia, do you have any thoughts on how Michele laid it out there, or just any general thoughts on the flexible block grant model?
Yeah, and again, I broadly agree with everything Michele has said. I think one really important component is to make sure there are incentives for states to continue to fund higher education. In the past, the federal government has sort of assumed that states will continue to invest in higher education, but this has not been the case. So one of my colleagues, Tom Harnish, has been doing some historical research and found that this original model of higher education financing, where the federal government is more minimally involved and really just does direct student aid, was built based on the assumption that state funding would maintain the percentage that it was at in the 1950s and 1960s, which is definitely not where we're at today. In the 1950s and 1960s, public college was essentially free in most states. So it's really important to not continue to make assumptions like that. And to do that, I think there needs to be a required match, and which there is in this program, which I think is great. And I also think that there needs to be enough of a federal investment to really incentivize states to take part in it. So depending on where we fall on that different dashboard of like down to 50 cents or up to $8, I think at the higher ends of that, it could be really effective, where if states know that they're getting $4, $6, or $8 for every dollar that they put in, I do think that would really incentivize their involvement. And then I also, just to echo on things Michele said, I think it's really important that the program is seen as sustainable. And that can be really difficult to do, but it needs to be an investment that states can rely on year in and year out. They need to know that as administrations change, this program will not go away, and it is worth their continued investment. And then again, I think the program needs to be really flexible, which I do believe the broad structure of this block grant is flexible. And that's really important to account for the different state contexts, their different political and economic environments. And a model like this, I do believe, would help all states be involved, even those that have not traditionally prioritized higher education investments, because they can kind of be met where they're at, and any additional dollar would be met with this match. So I do think this flexibility would work really well. On the other hand, one potential issue is that states that have been investing a lot in higher education, especially in the most recent years, might not feel that the program is fair, where they're essentially being penalized for already prioritizing higher education and not waiting for the federal government to come in and incentivize it. So they wouldn't get those same match dollars that they would if they had waited. So I'm anticipating that there might be some pushback from those type of states, but it's really, really hard to strike that balance between incentivizing states that have some of the lowest funding to participate, but also making sure that you're giving benefits to the states that are already doing a good job.
I really like how you frame that, Sophia. And actually, one element that we're not planning to discuss a lot today that is part of the BPC proposal is actually factoring into the state allocations things like the effort that they're contributing towards their, the commitment that they have towards higher education. So, if they're already putting in more dollars, recognizing that and rewarding it through this program. So you don't want to, do that entirely, because obviously then you're giving these states that are already putting the most funds, and that's not necessarily the goal here. But you also want to make sure we're not having the counter effect of what you're saying, which is only giving money to the states that aren't investing in their higher education systems already, and thereby doing the opposite of what we want to do in terms of encouraging the states that are already doing the right thing. Want to focus in on what you said, Sophia, about sustainability, because I think that's really the crux of the tool that we're presenting today and the core issue here, which is the rainy day funds. And I'm hoping to get both of your perspectives on what are the key elements to consider when we're talking about the creation and the allocation of resources to these rainy day funds. Where can things go wrong? What are the important things to keep in mind for how they are structured? So Michele, do you want to go first there?
Sure. I feel bad always going first. I feel like I should let Sophia go first. But I will just briefly say, I think the rainy day fund approach is not one that TICAS has spent a lot of time on. But I think it's certainly an interesting way around some of these big questions around, is it sustainable to create some kind of major new federal affordability guarantee, for example, and then give states no training wheels and give states no backstop to invest? I do think we have seen some concerns more broadly. Again, this is not necessarily speaking from TICAS's own work, but just concerns more broadly about the sustainability in general of rainy day funds, and kind of, again, the unique experiences seen during COVID and some other policy areas around rainy day funds not necessarily working as intended, or not necessarily covering everything that they were meant to, or kind of the implications for what those funds were going toward in a time when there was some kind of broader emergency where folks might have felt that those funds could be, diverted elsewhere. So I think, again, not something TICAS has focused too much on. Our mechanism is a little bit different, and something we've actually been rethinking, and we'll be putting out some new proposals around over the next year or so. But just to say, I think the sustainability piece, as Sophia mentioned, is really key here. And to think about when people, I think when people say rainy day funds, there can be a little bit of that, maybe it didn't quite come to pass during COVID that these protected us as much as we had thought, and kind of accounting for those experiences in other policy areas, and kind of making sure that those are addressed going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Michele. I'm sorry, Sophia, I should alternate. I've been alternating with each of you, but I should alternate who goes first in these questions so you don't have to respond each time. But I think, Michele, you made a really good point there about how there need to be some guardrails around what we mean by a rainy day fund and what those funds, when those funds can be used and how they can be used. And we've done a little bit of that as we spec'd out this proposal at BPC, but certainly more work to be done. And if they're flexible, and if they're so flexible that they can be thrown at whatever problem the state is having, that's obviously not the goal here. It's not going to accomplish the objective. And so you want to give some flexibility, obviously, in terms of how they're deployed, but filling the gaps that are specifically caused by these economic downturns in state higher education is really what we're seeking to achieve. Sophia, any thoughts that you have on sort of this rainy day fund concept and the structure and what things are important to keep in mind?
Yeah. So I think building on what both of you have said, my first answer is that to really answer this question about like specific components, we need to ask the states and we need to see what works for them, because the answer will differ, and that helps us see how flexible the program really needs to be. So touching on this idea of flexibility, I think one of the main challenges in this sort of rainy day provision is that states won't want the federal government micromanaging their budgets. So things about like how funds are used, when they can be used, states will want to be able to decide when it's time to use the rainy day funds and how they're used on their own. So I think if there's too much involvement and too many guardrails around this, then that will be a disincentive for states to participate. But in terms of like specific components, I do think that the affordability portion, where states can choose to divert their funds to affordability rather than the rainy day fund, and then the federal match is still doing both, I think that's actually a really helpful structural piece to have here, because it'll help states feel like they do have flexibility. I think it also helps with a potential issue of the idea of having to divert state funds from current students and what institutions need right now to later, especially in the states where state funding is down and institutions have very real needs to be able to educate their students. So I think both politically and practically, the option for states to be able to say, our funding is actually going towards student affordability now, while there's also this backfill happening towards the rainy day fund, would help address some of that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do a lot of work on the federal budget here at BPC, and we know that the government is not always great at prioritizing resources for tomorrow versus today. And I assume that the same, if not more so, would be said at the state government level. So building that in, I think, is critical, but at the same time, making sure that there is some immediate reward for states that are participating in this program is also an important balance, because that is what will get them to participate. So final question I have for both of you is thinking a little bit more about the politics of this. And Michele, you got into this a little bit earlier, but when we're thinking about these types of federal state partnerships and block grants and something that has a stable rainy day fund or some other element that is trying to keep funding stable, what do you all think are the political hurdles here, and how can we make sure that we're getting buy-in both from Republicans and Democrats, as well as federal and state policymakers and stakeholders? Sophia, why don't you go first here?
Okay, sure. I think there are probably numerous political challenges that this would face. One is that it's a fairly complex mechanism, and anytime you have complex policy, that makes it harder for even advocacy organizations to explain it and understand it and get behind it. So I think that's one potential issue. I also think, frankly, that the private and for-profit college lobby will not really support this. We've seen that in the past with any kind of proposal to invest primarily in public colleges. Private colleges prefer financial aid, which can go to any student attending any college because they get the benefit there. So that's definitely an issue when we're talking about federal and state investments directly into public institutions only. I think also just the increased polarization of higher education makes any big change a lot more difficult. So that will be a very difficult thing to face, and it's important to get both groups behind and make sure that this isn't getting pulled into the polarization piece and it's separate from that, and that everyone's on the same page about why this is important. And then I think going back again to the flexibility piece, states won't want to be involved if it doesn't make sense for them. So I think as flexible as this program could be would help a lot with that. So for example, if states are able to come up with plans for how they intend to use the funds, and then the accountability mechanism is just they're being held to those plans to ensure that they're doing that, rather than the federal government really being very involved in micromanaging. I think we saw with President Biden's free community college plan that states were actually not as on board as we might expect. And in large part, it was because there was so much control and so much specificity about what states would need to do to be involved.
Yeah, that's great. And the flexibility, even in terms of where the funds go, so not necessarily limiting exclusively to public institutions, might help with some of the constituencies you were talking about. Michele, do you have thoughts on some of the political hurdles here?
Sure, and I would certainly agree with everything Sophia said. And I think the flexibility piece it cannot be overstated. And the concerns about state allocation and fairness among states, and I think we did see in some past proposals that may have had more legs than others, even states that were politically bought in and maybe even publicly their leaders were bought in structurally to the program and the idea politically, they would actually not have bought in. Their legislature would not have bought in given kind of the funding stream, and it wouldn't have made sense for their state. And so I think that's a huge concern when even kind of states that are already investing a lot in public higher education and are politically inclined to do so going forward and are supportive of an administration that's proposing that would still probably not be able to buy into the program in a sustainable way. I think the other piece, as Sophia mentioned, is kind of the division between institution types. I think what we see, especially when we're looking at a free community college proposal, is not only the exclusion of private colleges, but the exclusion of four-year public institutions, especially if we're looking at some kind of marquee affordability guarantee being the centerpiece of the pitch for the program. If we are excluding four-year institutions, separately from the policy implications of that, just the political implications, four-year institutions are very politically powerful, and the more you divide the sector, the less support you will see for something like this. And so that's something, again, I don't have necessarily the answer to. I think there's many good reasons to invest first into your institutions, but I think from a purely pragmatic political standpoint, the more you divide the constituencies that you need to support the program, the lower chances you have of advancing it. I think the other piece here that Sophia mentioned that I want to add to is the Pell Grant piece. And I say this as a huge proponent of the Pell Grant program, and I spend much of my time at TICAS advocating for major new investments in the Pell Grant program. But I think, unfortunately, the idea of investing in Pell has been pitted as an alternative to investing in some kind of federal state funding partnership. And they basically are in competition with each other. And a lot of times folks will kind of throw up their hands and say, this is so complicated and ridiculous. Like no one can really quite figure this out. And at this point, let's just put more money in Pell and call it a day. And I think, again, as much as I love every new dollar in Pell, that will not address structural problems. That will not address kind of how we got to this point. And so if we are just putting more money in the federal voucher program, we are not creating a framework for a statutory relationship to stabilize funding. We are not creating a framework for the federal government to leverage its resources to incentivize equitable investments in public colleges. And so I think, as complicated as it is and as frustrating as it can be, and I'm sure Sophia has had many of these conversations as well, where often we will end up saying, like, I don't really know how to design this. And we're the ones who are supposed to be able to figure it out, but we even can't figure it out. But I think it's still worth trying to figure it out. And that goes back to probably the answer being a lot of flexibility and listening to state policymakers and kind of what their needs are. But I would heavily advocate against just throwing our hands up and saying, well, let's just throw more money in Pell and call it a day. I think this is something that can be figured out, and I think it's worth the effort to do so.
I like how you put that, Michele. And I think your points about trying not to divide the stakeholder community through a proposal like this for it to be politically viable is critical. And frankly, that's part of the reason why our task force decided to leave a lot of this flexibility when it comes to the federal program, and then let those battles be fought in state governments where they're closer to the ground and can deal with the constituencies and figure out what works best in their state, given the stakeholders that they have. Well, want to wrap up here, but thank you so much both for an enriching discussion about this important topic. Really appreciate you being here. Creating a system that can predictably ameliorate the issue of recession-related funding weakness in higher education should be a priority for federal policymaking, as I think we've all emphasized here today. BPC's modeling shows that such a system could be constructed with a reasonable amount of funding while simultaneously generating immediate improvements in college affordability as well as meaningful economic growth that brings in additional revenue at both the federal and state level. BPC will continue to lead in these conversations about advancing sensible changes to how we pay for higher education, and we look forward to continuing to partner with Michele and Sophia's organizations as well as with many of you who are here joining us today. Thank you all very much. If you have additional questions about the tool, feel free to email highered@bipartisanpolicy.org, and we'll speak to you all soon. Have a good day.